I will fight like I've never fought before, and we're going to continue fighting against President Trump and his radical views.
The United States remains on the sidelines in what has become the fastest growing market in the world for imported beef. Efforts to regain access to China are said to be progressing, but a reopening of that market to the U.S. is not imminent, according to the U.S. Meat Export Federation. China, as you recall, stopped importing U.S. beef in December 2000.
Tyson will shut down its Lexington, Nebraska facility and turn its Amarillo, Texas plant into a single full-capacity shift.
Farms have been hit hard by the pandemic, forcing suppliers to scale back production. And now the impact on the meat supply chain could directly impact shoppers.
It comes after Tyson Foods announced it was ending operations at a beef plant in Lexington, Nebraska.
Donald Trump's renewed tariffs are creating tremors across the global landscape. What began as a strategy to protect American industries has rapidly evolved into a geopolitical backlash. This has compelled countries around the world to cancel, pause, or reconsider major deals with the United States. The message is clear. The world is recalibrating, and America's aggressive trade posture is pushing allies and partners to seek alternatives.
The second Trump administration, and tonight, new inflation numbers are confirming what many economists have predicted, that Trump's tariffs would drive prices higher and higher.
The global beef market has just been hit by a shockwave, one powerful enough to rattle Washington, stun American ranchers, and force Canada into a bold, unprecedented stance that no one saw coming. The world thought it understood the balance of agricultural power, but suddenly a new player has emerged with unexpected force, speed, and confidence: Africa. This is not a small shift. This is not a headline exaggeration. This is a global market eruption, and the U.S. beef industry is right at the center of the storm. For decades, the United States controlled the narrative. The country was seen as the undisputed agricultural powerhouse, the giant that set the price, controlled the demand, and commanded global respect. But something historic has happened. Africa, long overlooked and underestimated in beef production, has quietly been building capacity, investing in modern ranching, partnering with global investors, and creating the kind of agricultural infrastructure that experts once said would take generations to achieve. Then the numbers came in, export figures soared, production costs dropped, quality certifications improved, and global buyers looking for affordability, sustainability, and scale started dumping U.S. beef in favor of African suppliers practically overnight. Suddenly, the world was asking the same question: how did Africa pull this off? Canada wasn't just watching from a distance. It was monitoring the situation closely because Canadian ranchers have been competing with U.S. producers for decades. When the data became impossible to ignore, Canadian officials went public with a blunt, unfiltered assessment that instantly exploded across global media. They accused the U.S. beef industry of becoming outdated, overpriced, slow to innovate, and dangerously overconfident, while Africa moved strategically, efficiently, and aggressively into the global spotlight. It was a diplomatic slap heard around the world. Canadian agricultural analysts openly praised Africa's rise, calling it the most important shift in global protein markets in the last 50 years. They warned that U.S. beef producers were unprepared for the competition and that the global market was now entering a new era, one dominated not by North America, but by African exporting nations that have mastered affordable large-scale production. The reaction in Washington was immediate. Phones began ringing, emergency meetings were scheduled, lobbyists rushed to Capitol Hill, ranchers in Texas, Nebraska, Kansas, Montana, and the Dakotas began to panic as buyers from Asia, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe abruptly shifted contracts to African suppliers offering higher volumes, lower costs, and faster delivery schedules. This was not supposed to happen, not this fast, not this dramatically, and certainly not at the expense of the U.S., yet it's happening. African beef, buoyed by low production costs, vast grazing lands, innovative ranching systems, and new export processing zones, has become the global market's hottest commodity. Countries like Kenya, Botswana, Namibia, Ethiopia, and South Africa are scaling at a pace that rivals the agricultural booms once seen in Brazil, Argentina, and Australia. With every new shipment leaving African ports, the global market tilts further. Meanwhile, Canada, tired of quietly competing with U.S. beef exports, took the opportunity to speak loud and clear. This is what happens when you underestimate emerging markets. This is what happens when you fail to innovate. This is what happens when you assume you will always be number one. The critique resonated worldwide. International food security experts began echoing the message. Economists warned that the U.S. beef industry is facing a structural crisis, not a temporary one. Global buyers reported that U.S. suppliers were struggling to match African prices and even struggling to match African quality in certain cuts, but the most shocking development came from major Asian importers. They announced long-term contracts with African beef processors, locking in billions of dollars in orders that once belonged to U.S. ranchers. This wasn't just about price, it was about trust, reliability, efficiency, growth. Africa was offering all three in ways the world simply could not ignore anymore. Pressure inside the U.S. beef industry is reaching a breaking point. Ranchers are furious. Many are blaming policy failures, market mismanagement, outdated processing systems, and skyrocketing domestic costs. Others accuse politicians of ignoring early warning signs. Some simply say the quiet truth out loud: Africa has outmaneuvered us. American beef processors are scrambling to update equipment, renegotiate supply chains, and push for new subsidies. But the global market moves faster than bureaucracy, and Africa is moving at record speed. Canada, meanwhile, is doubling down on its critique. Canadian officials and ranching associations are using this moment to highlight what they call a wake-up call for the United States. They argue that the world is no longer willing to pay premium prices for American beef when more affordable, environmentally friendly, and increasingly high-quality alternatives are coming out of Africa. Their statements have sparked debate across North America, dividing experts and provoking fierce responses from U.S. industry leaders, who insist Canada is exploiting the moment for political gain. But whether it's strategic or sincere, the message is clear: Africa's rise is real, and the U.S. must adapt or suffer the consequences. Global supermarkets, restaurant chains, and wholesale distributors are reporting dramatically increased purchases of African beef products. Food quality agencies are awarding high-grade certifications to African suppliers. And global shipping companies are expanding African routes at a speed that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. This is not just an agricultural success story. This is a geopolitical shift, a realignment of global supply chains, a humbling moment for the U.S. beef industry, and an extraordinary breakthrough for Africa. The world has entered a new chapter of agricultural power. A chapter where Africa's voice is louder, stronger, and more influential than ever before. A chapter where Canada is publicly challenging the U.S. for failing to see what was happening right in front of them. A chapter where the global meat industry is being rewritten in real time. Africa is not rising quietly. Africa is not rising slowly. Africa is rising with force, and the world is scrambling to adjust. Canada's warning shot is only the beginning. And as African beef continues to flood the global market, one thing is becoming crystal clear: the old rules are gone, the new rules are being written in Africa. The shock that erupted across North America after Canada's blunt criticism of the U.S. beef industry didn't fade. It grew louder, it spread, and as global markets continued shifting toward Africa's rapidly expanding beef sector, the situation evolved from a dramatic headline into a full-scale economic and political crisis. What started as a warning has now become a reckoning, one the U.S. can no longer ignore. Inside the United States, agricultural departments are scrambling to produce reports that do not paint a catastrophic picture, but every new dataset makes the truth impossible to sugarcoat. U.S. beef exports are slipping fast. Countries that once relied almost exclusively on American suppliers are now signing long-term agreements with African producers offering cheaper, cleaner, and increasingly reliable beef. The threat that analysts once dismissed as too early to worry about has now matured into an undeniable competitive force. Behind closed doors, American ranchers are expressing the same frustration. They feel blindsided. Many argue that officials ignored years of early signs: Africa's new mega ranches, modernized slaughterhouses, veterinary certification programs, and the steady growth in large processing centers built through international partnerships. Meanwhile, American ranching costs kept rising. Land prices, feed costs, labor shortages, regulatory burdens, and expensive equipment upgrades squeezed profits tighter every year. By the time policymakers realized Africa's transformation was real, the market had already begun shifting. Canada's criticism added fuel to the fire. The moment Canada publicly stated that the U.S. beef sector had fallen behind, the world stopped and listened. Canadian experts didn't hold back. They highlighted inefficiencies, lagging innovation, and ballooning production costs, points that stung because they were true. And Canada wasn't making noise just for attention. It was positioning itself as a smarter, more adaptive supplier, a country willing to acknowledge weaknesses and adjust while America clung to a past image of dominance, but the real force transforming the market was Africa's momentum. Across the continent, a sweeping agricultural renaissance was underway. Ranchers were adopting climate-smart grazing systems that regenerated soil instead of exhausting it. Governments were investing in animal health programs, leading to healthier, disease-resistant cattle that met the strict veterinary standards required by global markets. Investors were funding cold-chain logistics, ensuring beef could travel long distances without spoilage. And African processing plants, once criticized as outdated, were now operating with advanced food safety systems comparable to those in Europe and South America. The world took notice. Buyers in China, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, the UAE, Qatar, Singapore, and even parts of Europe began prioritizing African beef in their procurement strategies. Their motives weren't just financial. They were strategic. They wanted supply diversification, price stabilization, and partnerships that offered mutual growth, not the overdependence and fluctuating pricing that had plagued U.S. markets for years. And Africa delivered. Reports show African beef exports growing at double-digit rates month after month. African ports are expanding, refrigerated. Container shipments are increasing. New trade corridors are opening between African producers and Middle Eastern buyers. The speed of this evolution is stunning, faster than many agricultural analysts predicted was possible. Africa is not just catching up. It is overtaking. The U.S. beef industry is now experiencing a ripple effect that touches every corner of the supply chain. Feedlot owners are cutting herds. Processing plants are reporting reduced throughput. Cattle auctions in several states are seeing steep price drops. Banks are becoming cautious with ranching loans. Even supermarket chains across Asia and the Middle East are reducing their American beef orders, replacing them with cost-effective African imports. The shock is deep, the frustration is growing, the pressure is intense. Inside Washington, lawmakers are pointing fingers. Some blame the rise of African competitors on years of inadequate investment in agricultural modernization. Others claim environmental policies restricted American ranchers too aggressively. Still others argue corruption, mismanagement, and bureaucratic gridlock allowed the U.S. beef sector to stagnate while Africa surged ahead. But the truth is broader and more uncomfortable. Africa worked for this moment. While American officials assumed they would always dominate global protein markets, African producers and governments quietly built the foundation for an agricultural takeover. They modernized, they innovated, they partnered with investors who believed in Africa's potential. And now the rewards are pouring in. Canada's remarks were not just criticism, they were a global signal, a message that the agricultural power map is being redrawn, a message that the world must stop treating Africa as a minor player, a message that the U.S. must confront the new reality or risk losing even more ground. International analysts now describe the situation as a structural disruption, not a temporary fluctuation. Africa's rise is anchored in factors that won't fade: cheaper land, better climate conditions, government investment, massive grazing capacity, and a young, rapidly growing workforce. These advantages will only expand in the coming years. Meanwhile, U.S. ranchers are dealing with an industry in decline. They see Africa exporting beef at prices the U.S. cannot match. They see buyers signing decade-long contracts that bypass American suppliers entirely. They see Canadian ranchers capitalizing on the moment to strengthen their own position, and they feel something they haven't felt in decades: fear. Fear that the U.S. beef industry is losing its crown. Fear that Africa is rising too fast to catch. Fear that global loyalty is shifting and may never return. Africa, meanwhile, is embracing its new role with confidence. Farming associations are celebrating record exports. Processing centers are expanding workforces. Governments are negotiating better trade deals, securing billions in new opportunities. Rural communities are seeing new prosperity, with roads, cold storage facilities, veterinary clinics, and training hubs springing up across the continent. This is not an accident. This is strategy, executed with precision. And now, in international economic forums, Africa speaks from a position of newfound power earned through production, quality, and market dominance. Countries that once ignored Africa's agricultural voice are now treating it as essential. Canada's criticism of the U.S. was bold, but Africa's performance is what made that criticism impossible to dismiss. Every export shipment leaving African ports signals a new reality. Every contract signed with a major importer strengthens Africa's grip on the market. Every dip in U.S. exports marks another shift in global influence. This is the turning point in the battle over global beef supremacy. Africa is no longer the underdog, Canada is no longer silent, and the United States is no longer untouchable. The world is witnessing an agricultural revolution and Africa is leading it.